Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Joe Marinucci. I'm president of Downtown Cleveland Alliance. I'm also a 1980 graduate of Cleveland State University in political science, believe it or not. Unfortunately, I was at the university before the college was created. But on behalf of Dean Roland Anglin and the Maxine Goodman Levin College of Government Affairs, I want to welcome you to today's panel discussion, as well as keynote address by Jeff Finkel. And the topic today is the changing landscape of the economic development field, resources and relationships. And before we get started, I did want to recognize the Unger Family Foundation and the Third Federal Foundation Forum for sponsoring today's panel and keynote address. So please join me in giving them a round of applause. Dean Anglin, unfortunately, was not able to join us today. He's out of town, but he did ask me to convey his thanks to all of you for joining us. I am a member, I guess an emeritus member, of the visiting committee for the college. I was a former chair of that organization and have been very, very active with the college as well as the university for a number of years. So it's a pleasure to be with you here today. Today's keynote speaker is someone that I've known for a very, very long time, probably from the early 1980s. Jeff Finkel is President and CEO of the International Economic Development Council, IEDC. It is the world's largest economic development member organization, and Jeff is a recognized leader in an international authority on economic development. And again, I've known Jeff for a long, long time. Just to fully disclose, I was a former board chair of the organization back in 2006 and remained, again, very active with IEDC. And I would be remiss if I didn't note that one of Jeff's current board members, Tracy Nichols, who many of us have worked with over the years, is here in the audience. So thank you for being with us, Tracy. IEDC is the largest economic development practitioner organization, membership organization in the world. It has now, I believe, close to 5,000 members, both nationally and internationally. We had an opportunity to bring their International Development Annual Conference to Cleveland in 2016 and had a great time here. And by the way, I'm proud to say that working with JobsOhio and some of our other partners on that event, it was the largest event in IEDC history. So it was a great recognition of both Cleveland and the organization. Jeff, in addition to his work at IEDC, and by the way, he has been with IEDC and at the predecessor organization for IEDC, QED, the Council for Urban Economic Development, for close to 30 years, and has been, again, very active in the field of economic development. He previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. He's received numerous awards over the years from both at the federal and state levels and local levels. And in 2011, he was lauded by the U.S. Department of Commerce for his 25 years of stewardship in the profession. Jeff, undoubtedly, in our profession, is one of the people that if you want to if you have a question, if you seek advice, if you want to understand what's going on in different parts of the country or different parts of the world, to be honest, he's the person I pick up the phone and talk to and seek advice in terms of what's going on in the profession. He's a frequent speaker, public speaker, and has appeared on CBS Sunday Morning, Fox Television, and the Journal Report on PBS. He, by the way, is a very proud graduate of Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, and currently serves and maintains a strong connection with Ohio University's Voinovich School for Leadership and Public Affairs, where he serves as the Appalachian Economy Partnership Fellow. And he also is a part of what we call in the profession the Buckeye Mafia. There's many of us in the profession, and Jeff is kind of our unofficial leader. So with that, to talk a little bit about the changing dynamics in our profession, let me introduce Jeff Finkel.
It was near 30 years. It's closer to 32. But with that comes interesting little stories. Where's Molly? She's here somewhere. Molly comes up to me before we started today, and we're here in the Roberta Steinbacher Hall. And Roberta is still with us, and Molly says, Roberta sends her regards. And I'm saying, oh, I know Roberta? Apparently, she called me before the school was ever started and asked me questions about how to go about and develop a College of Urban Affairs that had economic development as a part of it. And apparently I gave some cogent answers at that time. And so she remembered herself to me today through Molly, and so it was wonderful to hear that I had some dinky responsibility in helping this develop. This is not my first time in this building. It's not my first time at Cleveland State. I have known many of the professors here. Cleveland State is unique in that you are turning out people that do know a lot about urban economic development in general, urban development studies. To the best that I can tell, there are probably only 2 programs in the country right now that are truly turning out people with master's degrees that resemble an economic development graduate degree, and that's here in the University of Southern Mississippi. There are a number of programs around the country that do have schools of public affairs, they have planning schools, but I think it's fair to say that this institution, going back as far as David Sweet, has been a leader in that area. I was talking to Matt before we walked up here, and I was talking about Ohio's impact on the profession of economic development. Joe is a past chair. For those of you who have been around for a while, you will remember Gary Conley, who was economic development director under George Voinovich, headed up the waterfront development for a while, went out to Los Angeles County, and then ended his career at TechSolve in Cincinnati. He is a past chair. Steve Budd down at Dayton Citywide, and then David Sweet was a past chair of our organization as well when it was called we merged 2 organizations, the American Economic Development Council. I'm going to give you a little presentation that we prepare every winter. We do an analysis as to what is going on in the economic development profession. And we've been doing this for the last 10 years, and I will steal some of my punchlines at this point. We are trying to spot, and we have over this 10-year, we're trying to spot trends. What is going on in this thing of we call economic development, and what is it that is different today than it might have been last year, the previous 5 years before. Punchline number 1, if you go back 10 years ago, we were starting to hit the skids of the recession. We would have been 2008, and if you asked economic developers what was their biggest problem, as they tried to help businesses grow, it would have been capital access. And that stayed consistent for probably the next 2 or 3 years, 4 years after that. The banks just were not lending. If you looked at the next kind of cluster of questions, and it stayed the same for a while, it would have been bad infrastructure. By the way, bad infrastructure, I think, is number 2 now. What is going on in the economy now from an economic developer's point of view should not come as a surprise to anybody who spends any time in this space or watching what's going on with business and industry. It is the lack of qualified workforce that can walk into a business and take a job tomorrow. And so we're having to retool in many ways. Businesses are having to retool. Our workforce delivery system is having to retool. Economic developers are having to retool. I will tell you one more thing before I jump into this, is I want to have a working definition of economic development, at least my elevator speech of what economic development is. And we defined economic development as the creation, retention, expansion of jobs, development of tax base, and the enhancement of wealth. And that's not wealth of rich people versus poor people. We want people to be wealthier. And so in the process. And if you look at the segment of the world that I work with, they tend to be the Joe Marinucci's of the world, the Tracy Nichols of the world, particularly when she was with the city of Cleveland, but it's city agencies, county agencies, the state economic development agencies, chambers of commerce. Utility companies actually do economic development. We have universities who have economic development functions. We have 2 foundations represented here today. So there's a whole variety of people that have their toes in this space that we call economic development, and we're trying to all influence in some way. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time talking about IEDC. Joe did a pretty good job of that. We're going to talk about some of the 21st century shifts. We're going to talk a little bit about key challenges and what our EDO is doing. Joe told us we have more than 5,000 members. I've gone through the folks that are active. As I indicated a few minutes ago, we were a merger of 2 groups, and there's a funny little history of these 2 groups. We are the definition of of something you would call the ultimate public-private partnership. The American Industrial Development Council was formed in about 1926, excuse me. We were 90 years old 2 years ago. They were founded with the help of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. These tended to be rural places. They tended to be utility companies and railroads. They tended to do smokestack chasing. And that was what economic development was to the American Industrial Development Council, changed their name to AEDC. QED, the Council for Urban Economic Development, started out as the Hub Council, helping urban businesses. It was founded in 1967 under the auspices of the National League of Cities and U.S. Conference of Mayors. Chambers of Commerce, city governments, public-private partnership. Interesting, one of the original founders was a gentleman by the name of Mel Roebuck. Mel Roebuck went on to work for Forest City Enterprises and moved to Boston and worked on some Forest City projects there. But he essentially, in the 1960s, early 70s, would have had what would have been Tracy's job in the city of Cleveland at that time. We are a membership association. If you don't know us, many of you belong to an association of some sort or another, a bar association, a medical association, an accountancy association. All associations are the same. They do conferences, seminars, they do turn out newsletters, they accredit things, they certify things. At the end of the day, on the how do you do it is all the same. What is different is the content. And our content, and we specialize in economic development. And we try to be very narrow in that view of economic development. We can all argue, for instance, that housing is part of economic development. But there are so many housing organizations in Washington. I try to keep our exposure to that limited because there are very few organizations that truly hone in on job creation, retention, expansion on a day-to-day basis. We'll talk about it from time to time. So let's talk about what are these shifts that economic developers are dealing with. There have been a lot of things that have made these jobs, and having had a front seat for 31, going on 32 years, things have really changed over that period of time. When I started in 1986, if you walk down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., you would basically see empty building after empty building after empty building. You could repeat that in downtown after downtown after downtown across the United States. We had come through the 60s and the riots that had impacted many communities. We had had middle-class flight. Sometimes we referred to it as white flight, but it actually was middle-class flight that we were experiencing. People did not necessarily want to live in the cities anymore. Eisenhower had built these beltways around many of our cities. It sucked a fair amount of investment out of our cities. So we were dealing, and we were joking about this a little earlier, we were starting to think about placemaking. How were we going to make these places more competitive, more livable, so that we could get people to not see these hollowed out messes that we call downtowns. We've made tremendous strides in that. We are now dealing with globalization, and we have been probably for the last 15 years. We've used such terms as outsourcing, offshoring. We've gone through an internet boom. We're dealing with issues of climate change. One of the interesting things that we're dealing with that I don't remember as much is this whole issue of increase in disasters. You know, we did not have hurricanes hit the U.S. shores in quite the complexity and size and damage creation that we're having now. This past year alone, we were dealing with Harvey, Maria, and Irma, who have all devastated places in Texas, Florida, Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico, just here in the United States. There were other islands hit in the Caribbean as well. Shifting energy markets, we dealt with the Great Recession, and we're having to deal with issues like terrorism. We have this issue of what we're referring to as the technology conundrum. What is causing us to lose manufacturing jobs? Actually, we're starting to gain some of them back. One could argue China, Vietnam, Thailand, the East has taken a lot of those technology jobs. One of the biggest causes of job loss has been the improved technology. I can remember if we came to Youngstown, we went to Pittsburgh, we could find steel plant employers that would be 800, 1,200 employees. You can run a mini mill these days with about 80 employees and produce about the same amount of steel as you would have produced at one of those plants in the 1960s. So many jobs are becoming obsolete, but we're having increases in output. Between 2000 and 2009, and remember this is going to include a fair amount of the recession, we lost in the manufacturing sector about 5.8 million, nearly 6 million jobs. And when we would look at manufacturing jobs, we would look at those jobs as saying they have the best spin-off, meaning you'd have the best wages coming out of there for blue-collar jobs, and their effect in a community would be much higher than a retail job, for instance. And we've lost a fair amount of that. Manufacturing jobs between 2000 and 2015 declined by 29%. But the gross domestic product increase is nearly 25%. We are also now dealing with this thing called the sharing economy. Uber, Airbnb. By the way, I do not have an Uber account. I'm proud of that, and I will continue not to have one. Why? I don't like non-regulated utilities, and Uber, in my opinion, is a non-regulated utility. You do not, when you get into that car, you do not know what you're getting into. In New York, we have bankrupted 2 credit unions, and hundreds of drivers have lost their life savings because they bought a medallion counting on the city of New York to honor that medallion as a way of entering the space, and then they did not regulate Uber when it came into the marketplace. So there have been, there is a bad side to this non-regulation that we're doing. But I see this, you know, I've decided that in life sometimes there are bad ideas that come out of 2 places, New York and Silicon Valley. And so Silicon Valley has taken us, took us into an internet bust. At one point, we all lost lots of money, and New York takes us through leveraged buyouts that leaves lots of debt and a business with fewer employees with no benefits as a result of what they do. And I tend to be a little suspicious at times and what are great ideas that come out of these places. I actually just came back from an Institute for the Future event, and ITF is located in Silicon Valley. And the things that they're talking about that we're going to be dealing with in the next decade is somewhat unbelievable. And everything that we know, we might as well throw out if you listen to them and what they're hearing from Silicon Valley. The 6 sectors that will generate the most new jobs in the next 5 years: healthcare, business services, leisure, construction, manufacturing, and retail. and I'm not sure that's going to be a neighborhood retailer. By the way, watch April 14th, I believe, the U.S. Supreme Court is going to be dealing with local or sales taxation on internet sales. And frankly, many economic developers are on the side of taxing internet sales because that would put a penalty for ordering on the internet and thus making bricks and mortar retailers more competitive and possibly bring back a number of retailers that are otherwise having problems. If that happens, we may end up starting to reverse that trend of all this internet sales and at least give bricks and mortar retailers a little bit more fair advantage. Most job gains since the Great Recession are low-paying jobs, and that has been a difficulty. We are not getting back the mid-ranging jobs that we had before. So this makes for a troubling landscape in many ways, or not troubling, because the economy is actually doing well in a variety of ways. But we are generating a lot of jobs at the lower end, and we have left a number of people behind as we've done those. Let me make sure what I've done here. Oops, excuse me, I'm going the wrong direction. So we do a study every year, and I talked about this at the very beginning. The three greatest challenges in 2017: lack of skilled labor, inadequate infrastructure, and there is still some cost cutting going on in state and local government. In 2011, budget cuts was number one, capital access was number two, and declines in real estate occupancy and real estate value was the number three issue. One of the interesting things in the economic development space, the fastest growing job in economic development these days is somebody with a title of workforce. They are talent retention, they're talent attraction, because they are hearing so many things for many of the employers in their community and their difficulty in finding the right workforce. I think I will add a personal editorial note. I think some of these workforce issues could be solved, however, for some of these companies if they only increased wages a little bit. I think they'd have more people come running to their door. We talked about some of the technology advancements that are going on, and I just indicated that EDOs are serving as a linchpin. Disasters are hitting us on a fairly common basis. Houston got hard hit by Harvey. New York City got hit hard by Sandy. Miami actually missed Maria and Irma, but San Juan certainly didn't. So if you start to look at what's going on in some of our major cities, the tenacity of some of these storms tend to be increasing. New York got hit by on September 11th, 2001 by the Twin Towers being hit. You know, every now and then the earth shakes in California, and LA and San Francisco have both taken the brunt of that. Communities do not necessarily have the resilience standards that they need in order to figure out how they're going to recover when these things hit. So one of the questions we also ask is, to what degree are equity and economic opportunity a concern for your economic development organization? And I will tell you this is a relatively new issue, and it has not been in our survey for the last 10 years. It was actually the wipeout and the recession that has caused us to think about this. But now I would say probably the first time we asked this question, about 20% were actually thinking about it, and IEDC has been trying to get our members to think about how do you create opportunities for people that are being left behind. And inclusion or equity, as whatever term you use, is becoming a greater return for many. A percentage of the population are living in poverty. You can use this heat map or whatever you want to call it that shows where we have poverty across the country. I think you could also lay over top of that, you know, where our business is expanding, and you would find in many cases you have a great deal of poverty, but you've also got pockets of wealth, and those opportunities are not being expanded. Facts and figures that hinder economic opportunity. U.S. ranks 30th percentile in economic inequality. Low unemployment rates does not necessarily mean you have a great economy. It just may mean you're paying a lot of people low wages. And we've got to start to figure out how to turn that around. Over 13.5% of part-time workers are classified as working poor. And if you look at those Lyft drivers, those Uber drivers, many of them are struggling in their own right, and Lyft and Uber are really not necessarily lifting anybody out of poverty. It's in many cases allowing people who are already in poverty to have a second job. And there are 750,000 Americans who are homeless on any given night. Top 10 metros with concentrated poverty. Start with Detroit, and you can work down to Miami. And the challenges of addressing equity, and actually that is the major theme of our annual conference that's going to be held in Atlanta this year. And Atlanta, when they do a look at what's going on in their community, they say that this is a major issue that they have to deal with because they have a real disconnect between the wealthy and the poor in their communities. What are EDOs doing? So one of the questions we also ask is, where are you increasing your efforts? One of the larger places that people are working on is, frankly, despite our own faults as a nation, we are better than many others in terms of opportunities for investing. Foreign direct investment is yielding a great deal of jobs. I was yesterday with the Secretary of Commerce. I'm on an International Trade Advisory Commission for the U.S. government, and we were talking about all of those opportunities for foreign direct investment. Where would you focus your clusters? Our friend from Cranes and I were talking before we spoke here. Where are communities thinking about where their jobs will come from in the future? Advanced manufacturing is number one. Healthcare is number two. Let's see, number three is logistics, and places like Central Ohio where you have 70 and 71, and with 75 not that far away. Those are awesome places for as logistics centers. And then you have places like Rickenbacker Air Force Base and Wilmington Air Force, the former Wilmington Air Force Base. Key economic development strategies these days. We're seeing more collaboration among various organizations, more attention on keeping what you have in your community. We call that business retention. Many of our economic developers are focused on small business creation / entrepreneurship. There's a funny little community over in Indiana called Elkhart, Indiana. Some of you may remember NBC during the recession did an ongoing project they called the Elkhart Project. Do you know why Elkhart got signaled out? Because in down times it has some of the worst unemployment in the country. And why is that? They really only have two major brands of business: sport utility or vans and mobile homes. And so what do people not buy in a recession? A converted van or a mobile home. So if you look at their waves of employment and unemployment, Elkhart has some of the worst. So many communities need to think about how do they diversify their workforce or their business base so they don't find themselves in that purposes. How many EDOs are entering into partnerships? This may seem like a no-brainer. When we first started doing this study, it was about 50-50, and many organizations, as they started to get tighter on resources, found themselves having to cut back. Educational institutions that EDOs partnered with on this whole workforce thing, without question, and this is not a shot at four-year institutions, community colleges win the day because they're actually going into plants and other large businesses to help them with workforce training. Approaching equitable economic development, we're looking for growth incomes, we're looking for a development strategy that allows that to happen, we're looking for projects, and we're looking for organizations that can manage that. So that, I spoke in Scotland a number of years ago, and when I got done and these people are listening to me talk through a Scottish ear, they said I talk too fast. But I discovered that for American audiences, they tend to be able to keep up, even though I did try to get through this as quickly as possible. Iryna, thank you for inviting me to the air today, and I look forward to hearing the other speakers.
Thank you, Jeff, for that great presentation in terms of the profession and some of the trends that you're seeing and IED is seeing across the board in economic development organizations. I forgot to mention at the onset that this program is being video recorded, so be very careful with the questions that you ask. But I assume it'll be available on the college website after tonight's presentations. I have the honor of introducing our panel. You've obviously already heard from Jeff, and Jeff will also be available to answer questions along with the panelists towards the end of today's presentation. But I can start to my far left. I'd like to introduce Sasa Drezgic. Am I pronouncing it close enough? Thank you. He is a PhD and an associate professor at the Faculty of Economics with the University of Rijeka in Croatia. In 2016, Sasa received an appointment as the Deputy Minister of Finance for Croatia. Since 2002, he has been a team leader and participated in several projects of the Croatian Ministry of Science, Education and Sport, the Urban Institute, and UNDP in the field of public finance with a focus in the field of intergovernmental fiscal relations. In 2009 and 2010, he was a visiting fellow at the Global Governance Center at the London School of Economics and Political Science. To his right is Deborah Hoover, who has served as President and CEO of the Burton D. Morgan Foundation since 2007. Deborah has been instrumental in establishing the Foundation's Northeast Ohio Collegiate Entrepreneurship Program, a Kaufman Campus SM initiative to spread entrepreneurship across liberal arts campuses, and in establishing NEO-LaunchNet, formerly the Blackstone Launchpad program. She spearheaded the Foundation's decision to establish the Entrepreneurship Education Experiment, a research center that advances the field of entrepreneurship education through leading-edge research and projects and programs. Deborah also received the Northeast Ohio EY Entrepreneur of the Year Award in 2014. And most recently, she also served from 2013 to 2015 as chair of the Fund for Our Economic Future, which many of us know is the philanthropic collaborative, created in 2004 to advance the economic competitiveness of Northeast Ohio. Our next panelist is Shilpa Kedar, who is the Program Director for Economic and Workforce Development at the Cleveland Foundation. She works closely with city leaders, civic groups, and foundation staff to support ongoing economic development efforts and develop new ones benefiting Greater Cleveland. Before she joined the Cleveland Foundation, she was Director of Business Attraction for Team NEO, where she collaborated with other Northeast Ohio development groups to identify and secure business opportunities for the region. Previously, she coordinated grant-making and projects to strengthen the area nonprofits for Cleveland Social Venture Partners and was a researcher for the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, did I pronounce it? Ahmedabad, a top business school in India. Next to her is Matt Waldo, who is the Senior Manager for Research and Analysis at JobsOhio. Matt has led economic development and intelligence in 2 states, contributing to mobile projects creating over 100,000 new jobs. He has led the research and analysis team at JobsOhio since the beginning of 2014. In 2017, JobsOhio was recognized as the 3rd best state economic development organization by the International Economic Development Council, and Ohio was the top state for new job creation according to Ernst & Young. So I'm sure he's going to be talking a little bit more about some of the successes he's seen across the state. Previously, Matt was Director of Research for Indy Partnership in the Indianapolis Chamber of Commerce, where his teams won Best Research Project supporting business development. And then our moderator for today is our own Iryna Lendel, who again is a PhD and a research associate professor and the director of the Center for Economic Development here at the Levin College, Cleveland State. Dr. Lendel is an economist with vast experience conducting academic and applied research and analyzing regional economic development. Her research portfolio includes projects on industrial analysis, high-tech industries, the oil and gas industry, art industries, steel industry, and many others that I won't continue to name, but I could also share with you that she headed up our economic development impact study for the Republican National Convention, which was here a number of years ago. So we really appreciate her good work in that area. So with that, I'll turn it over to you and go forward with the panel. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Joe. So, Joe, thank you for introduction. Jeff, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I invited all these panelists because we wanted to have the view of the world, and we want to learn how to apply that view to our very local problems in Cleveland. So today we are very lucky to have three grand pillars that will reflect on Jeff's national view of economic development field. And we will start with the international perspective that Sasha represents. Then we would want Matt to tell us what's going on at the state perspective. And we have two local foundations that are local but do slightly different fields as their emphasis in economic development to reflect how this economic development changes are reflecting changes in their agenda and support. Sasha, would you please reflect on the international aspects and tell us a little bit about similarities and differences, how European economic development issues are coincide with our own, what we can learn from each other. And since you represent the university and we're conducting this forum in the walls of the good Levin that is taking big steps in public policy, what is the contribution of these forums, the thought process, universities, and this, how we can help through these changes of the economic development field?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to be here. I love Cleveland. I love this school, and I also love Cavs. So I'm a big fan. So I was fortunate to be here from 2006, thanks to Unger Foundation. I'm here under this umbrella. So basically, I was able to really be in this university, see how this university functions, and also in recent years I was able to see how things work in practice. So thanks for the really great presentation. I would like I think I have a lot of things to reflect in terms of differences with United States and EU system. And please, if I'm too long, stop me. We can do this in two parts. But I would like to say, first of all, my kind of course, these are not just objective kind of remarks. There must be subjective, but I have some conclusions, which are, firstly, that I believe that in terms of regulation, kind of government intervention in EU is more kind of system-based. It tries to cover all kind of overall wider picture, having in mind kind of public goods and the welfare system as much covered as possible with the government. Here in U.S. system, my kind of impression that regulation is more responsive to the free market, in a sense that here free market is more stimulated, and then sort of maybe some of the failures are covered by the government's ex post, I would say. Then there's there are differences, having in mind that in Europe government intervenes more. It was very interesting for me to see the role of non-profit organizations here. So the non-profit organizations here have really effect and extensively, intensively. If I compare European system, in a way, there is no such need for non-profit systems, and this need is far more different than here. I would also address the structure of funding, which is very interesting in terms of funding economic development projects, because it's fascinating here that actually philanthropy really does a lot of work in terms of private sector engagement. In Europe, non-profit organizations and economic development organizations are mostly financed by the government itself. So this creates a lot of different activities covered by the non-profits. This creates a lot of different effects, and if you're interested, I can reflect more on that issue. Also, you have much more decentralized system, autonomous local governments and districts and so on in comparing with the Europe. Here, you are much less restrictive in terms of technology and innovation. So, for example, Jeff mentioned Uber. So, for example, there's a fierce struggle in a lot of European countries of banning the Uber. So, and this is not just Uber, but there's a kind of struggle between economy of sharing, which is really clashes with a restrictive system that we have in Europe. So in terms of innovations and new products, in that sense, private sector is far better off here in States. I would say also that here there are many inefficiencies in States due to kind of systematic failures. So in a way, I think the system in terms of governance and government could be created far better in terms of systematic approach. On the other hand, in Europe, we have inefficient system not because of the coverage, but the governments are generally far more inefficient than here. So I would say in most of the European countries, this kind of ethics of the public sector and also conditions of the public sector are, I would say, on a lower level. And also, it is interesting to see that I would say in terms of need for economic development organizations, I would say in Europe they're mostly, we have economic divergences which are based on kind of initial conditions of the countries. So we have this, I would say, West and East issues which generate systematic demographic and migration issues for the Eastern economies, which are less competitive. In States, I would say you have far deeper issues regarding not just economic inequalities, but different other social inequalities. I would just mention like issues of social mobility. The social mobility issue here is far more, I would say, problematic than in Europe. And this has a lot of is connected with the schools. And also I already stated that it is fascinating here that the economic development agencies and organizations that I was able to see are far more kind of prone to collaboration, creating this vast, wide social networks, which is not the case in EU. So I would end with this. I'm sorry, maybe I was too long, but these were like my observations.
No, thank you very much. It's a really very interesting observation. So whenever you see something you want the further ask one of the panelists, please take your advantage to write the questions. But at this point, I would want Matt to reflect. So how the changes we see in economic development organizations agenda are reflected in state-level agencies, and because you're working so closely with the businesses, what changes do you see on the recipients of the services often, the business level?
Yeah, well, first of all, again, thank you, Dr. Lendel, and to the college for hosting us here today, and additionally, thanks to some of our other local partners, Team NEO, the Morgan Foundation, which we're both supporters of Team NEO's work. And again, congratulations to Team NEO for record performance in 2017. And also pleased to announce that JobsOhio had also record performance on capital investment and payroll numbers for 2017. So we're very pleased to report that, and you can find additional details about that at jobs-ohio.com if you want to download our annual report. So that's sort of my shameless plug. A lot of what you'll hear from me is metrics driven because as the manager of the research function at JobsOhio, my job is really to look at the numbers and to report results and to help underpin strategy with some of that analysis. I think that the survey results that IEDC and Mr. Finkel presented here are really interesting and pretty consistent with what we're seeing. Particularly the theme of increased necessity of improving and upskilling talent. So along that line, JobsOhio created really the most unique talent program within economic development agencies in the country at this point. So we are the only state-level economic development organization that has a full suite, essentially a turnkey talent acquisition program for our clients. And so that's everything from marketing for talent to screening talent to placing talent and follow-up even after they've been placed. Additionally, talent is really one of the pillars of innovation, right? So another pillar of innovation is really research and development. And JobsOhio added another program, the Research and Development Loans and Grants Program, last year and at the end of 2016. And we're pleased to report that we've committed almost $50 million in research and development funding to private entities. Now, those private entities have to work with universities, particularly the state's great research universities, many of which are here in Cleveland. And then thirdly, we added another program that's pretty consistent with the infrastructure theme that Mr. Finkel touched on, which is that we added a program called Site Ohio. And we began developing that program 2 years ago and really began to launch it in earnest last year. And this is what we're calling a site authentication program. We call it authentication because there really is no accrediting body nationally for site preparedness programs. So many states have these and they differ. There may be an opportunity to develop some sort of accreditation program at the national level on these at some point, but the point is that these are three pillars of attracting new companies and new jobs to Ohio. And so we've developed new programs in each of these areas, and we think that it's paying off. JobsOhio is now supported almost 140,000 job commitments, new job commitments. That doesn't include retention of existing jobs since founding the organization in 2011. And so, we're really proud of that success, and we think that these new programs and the additional capital and jobs commitments that that we've helped to foster in 2017 have set the stage for additional growth going forward. How is that translated into the broader economy, I think, is probably a question that a lot of you have. And so the state of Ohio has increased, in the time that JobsOhio has been in existence, has increased private sector employment by almost 500,000 additional private sector jobs. And this is about 80% better than the average for the region, for the geographic region. So we have far outpaced our regional competitors in that time frame. And again, we believe that we've set the stage through these additional program offerings to keep that trend moving forward.
And how do we look compared to our traditional group of comparison states?
Yeah, so another thing that was running through my mind when Mr. Finkel was talking, was just that we can't just focus on the traditional metrics You know, I'm a metrics person, as I mentioned. We can't just focus on the traditional metrics anymore. It's not just new job creation. It's not just capital investment. There are concerns about equity. There are concerns about personal wealth creation. There are concerns about poverty. There are concerns about labor participation. So we're measuring all of these things. And so on most of these things, we think that, well, we know, frankly, that we're doing better than our regional counterparts. So for example, and you can find some of these in our annual report in the economic overview section, but disposable income has increased faster in Ohio than the regional average over the last, well, since 2011 when JobsOhio was created. Economic diversity has improved. We're actually, according to Implan, which is an economic impact modeling software company, they've done analysis using, it's kind of complicated, but they call it the Shannon-Weaver Index, which is actually also used for biodiversity measuring. But at any rate, by the Shannon-Weaver Index, Ohio has the third most diverse economy in the country. And we think that that is something that we're trying to contribute to as well by not just trying to support our sort of legacy industries, but also trying to support more aspirational industries like IT and biotech. And additionally, I would say that you know, we're looking at labor participation, and you know, we probably have a ways to go there, but we've seen some recent improvement in the labor participation rate as well, compared to some of our regional counterparts.
Thank you. On a local level, Deb, we saw from the Jeff's presentation that entrepreneurship and the workforce are still two leading issues that EDOs are dealing with. And in your foundation, being the forward in entrepreneurship support and support for training, how are you evolving with this change of the economic development field?
Well, thank you for including us so that we can share our perspective this afternoon. And I want to say that Shilpa and I are often working together to solve these problems. We may come at it from slightly different angles, but very much partners in this work across the region. I think we're fortunate at Burton D. Morgan Foundation that entrepreneurship is really at the core of who we are. Our donor, Burton D. Morgan, was sort of an entrepreneur on steroids, really just lived and breathed this throughout his adult life. And I'll even say that he started as a kid, really. He was an entrepreneur even as a child. So the foundation is now 50 years old with a mission to champion entrepreneurship here primarily in Northeast Ohio. And so we do that in 3 different ways. We're focused on programs that introduce children to entrepreneurship, so you know, in the K through 12 space. And then also working on virtually every single college campus in Northeast Ohio on entrepreneurship programs. And then certainly also in the adult space. And in all of that work, we're not looking at those different buckets of work as silos. We're definitely trying to build pathways and conduits so that students can move from one level of entrepreneurship education to another, whatever that looks like for them in their particular school or their neighborhood. So offering up a lot of choices for people for how they might want to pursue entrepreneurship. And then we are, I think we also think of ourselves very much as an ecosystem builder across the region. And so while a big part of our work is providing the grants that help organizations to build effective programming in entrepreneurship, it's a lot of the work that occurs behind the scenes that really takes up the bulk of our time, and that's what we consider this ecosystem building role. Last year, I was fortunate to attend a conference at the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City. We're really looking at entrepreneurship building as a new emerging profession within the economic development field. There were about 400 attendees at this conference, and it was just fascinating to see the backgrounds and the mix of all of these people coming together, very much from different backgrounds. I wouldn't consider them at all to be traditional participants in the economic development field, but some were teachers, faculty members, community activists, bankers, lawyers, just, you know, all kinds of professions, but all of these people really passionate about entrepreneurship and building inclusive entrepreneurship programs within their own communities, but coming at it from lots of different angles. So as I listened to Jeff's presentation and that entrepreneurship piece of this, I think that that's a new and emerging trend, and one that we should all keep a close eye on. And I see it happening, and I see it in Akron with the development of the new Bounce Innovation Hub, and all of the people who are stepping up out of that community who either are ecosystem builders or want to become ecosystem builders, just all kinds of opportunities for people to get involved, drawing in really a broad spectrum of the entire community to do this work. And I think that that's a big part of what it's going to take. And so, as I said, I mean, that's how I spend a good deal of my time and how my staff members spend their time. A lot of it has to do with building collaborative relationships, like the one I have with Shilpa and her team at Cleveland Foundation, also through my colleagues at Fund for Economic Future, and then through some other collaborative partnerships that we help to generate in the entrepreneurship field, like the Jumpstart Higher Education Collaboration Council. That's CSU is a member of that, and so we bring Jumpstart and Morgan Foundation bring together representatives of virtually every campus in Northeast Ohio to explore topics that relate to entrepreneurship programming on their campuses. Just building those networks through the day-to-day work that takes, sort of connecting the dots of this person over here who needs to talk to that person, and then they can get together, you know, and work on a particular project. Inclusion is a very important part of the work that we do. Shilpa and I work together on the Forward Cities initiative for our Northeast Ohio to participate in Forward Cities, which was a 4-city collaboration looking at inclusive entrepreneurship and innovation. And that work is still continuing here in Cleveland and Northeast Ohio. I also think that advocacy and building awareness is a big part of what our foundation can do. Communication continues to be really at the core of who we are. And then also just having a long-term commitment to this work. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. You know, we've been working in this manner for now more than a decade, and I feel like the work has really just begun, and there's just so much more work that needs to be achieved. And finally, we mentioned earlier about our entrepreneurship education experiment. I think in the field of philanthropy, it's unusual for a foundation to be so laser focused on supporting entrepreneurship in a region. So what we learn from the work that we do, we don't really want to keep that within the walls of the foundation. We want to get those lessons that we have learned through hard knocks and making mistakes, you know, and maybe eventually getting it right, and to get that information out into the community and helping our colleagues to do their work. So that's also a big way that we spend our time. So I hope that answers the question.
That's a very thorough answer, and if you would pass baton to Shilpa, because she probably has the most difficult question. As representing community philanthropic organization, sure. I know that all people are going to look down and see if something's changing in Cleveland. That's a first kind of a organization that they want to be responsible for, especially here having a history of Cleveland Foundation being so heavily involved in community and economic development. But the difficulty of question is, what would be your assessment, how the, if you will, recipe for this change in economic development in Cleveland is and is not typical because of our heavy burden of manufacturing, but also a concentration of business in art, for example, and other great assets that we have. So how the community foundation reflect on these changes in change in economic development?
Sure. So good afternoon, good evening, whatever is appropriate right now. Thank you for having me here. I'd like to pick up on your point about the Cleveland Foundation being a community foundation. We are 103 years old now, the first community foundation in the world. And what's interesting about community foundations is that we don't typically be in the business of grant making in economic development. We were one of the first foundations to get into grant making here. And the reason for getting into this space was very simple. If we didn't do it and the economy continued to decline and the region continued to decline, we would end up having a much higher load in terms of taking care of the poor populations in our community, feeding the hungry, clothing the poor, which is the typical role of a community foundation. And we wanted to do our piece in getting ahead of that and helping mitigate some of these issues. And so in terms of what the Cleveland area has been doing, it has been actually leveraging the legacy industries. I look at them as assets, especially the manufacturing sector, which is still the 5th largest employer in the region, leveraging these legacy industries and the infrastructure that is being built to support these industries to then reinvent our community, reinvent our region into getting into new industries, whether that's the biomedical industry, which is was aspirational and is very quickly becoming reality, and looking at applications of, say, the Internet of Things to say how does the Internet of Things now apply to the manufacturing industry and really raise the competitiveness of our industries, whether that's manufacturing or the biomedical industry or simply infrastructure in terms of energy, water, and so on. I'd also like to say, Jeff, your presentation really resonated with me for a number of reasons. The fact that the EDOs are reporting that 55% of the EDOs are now focusing on the lack of skilled labor is just reflective of how I'm spending my time. 70% of my time today is focused on workforce development, right? I started with the title of Program Director for Economic Development, and now it's been extended to Economic and Workforce Development to really call out and be very explicit about the fact that we know that this is a big issue and that we are doing what we can to be very intentional about developing workforce to meet our businesses' needs and to also serve the residents in our community. The other aspect was the equity and inclusion. That's, of course, something that is very core to a community foundation's heart, a private foundation's heart. And it is very encouraging to see that many institutions, organizations, nonprofits in Cleveland today are beginning to finally focus on the issues of racial equity. And I'm sure we're going to talk more about that. But that really resonated with me, so I wanted to say that to Jeff. I started my career in the United States in economic development, working for Team NEO for 3.5 years. And I remember going to IEDC conferences and not going to the workforce sessions because it wasn't that important then. And today I do think workforce development is the new economic development. Unless we crack the code on that, we are not going to be able to transform our regions.
Thank you. And I want to continue on a theme you have touched, you and Deb. And we've heard today a lot about workforce, and Matt said that recently they added this as one of the most important pillars in acquiring the talent. And this is the most common agenda for economic development organizations today. However, if you think from the economist perspective, workforce and labor is an economic resource that should be reimbursed by a salary. So why are we having this market failure? Why market is not adequately reimbursing workforce to the point where we should mitigate the shortages with just pricing it higher? What do you think? And are we really targeting with the training, targeting the core issue of this problem, or we just mitigating the consequences? Whoever wants to take it first.
Competition. So we are in a worldwide competition for labor. And to the extent that our labor prices get too high, somebody is going to take that product and offshore it, where we were 12, 15 years ago when we were having so much manufacturing. Now, I said a flippant remark when I was up there that I think there should be some pressure on wages, and that many of these companies will solve some of their workforce issues by increasing wages. But if that gets too far ahead, then that company's going to have to make a decision. Do they continue to hire here, or do they offshore or outsource? And we're having that debate right now as the president has started talking about tariffs. You know, he's hoping to force jobs back here as a result, but I'm not sure you can tariff everything that, you know, you're going to lose something here. It's going to backlash in a different.
Right, and for a while it wasn't the salaries. We blamed the healthcare cost in the package of the workforce. So is this changing? Is this really like the portion of wage that we are blaming? What do you think?
I don't know if I can address it from the healthcare point of view, but I can jump in on other things. So I do think it's also a combination of barriers, not just salaries and wages, but other barriers that are much softer but very real. If you are living in the core city of Cleveland and need to travel to Solon or the outer ring suburbs to find a good job that pays well, right? So if you're a mom that has to drop off children to childcare and then use public transportation to get to these far-off locations, that's very hard. And if you are on the second shift or the third shift, way harder, right? So I'm not sure if salaries is the only issue that is not solving the problem. There are these softer barriers, and that's where I think the economic development organizations and the community that provides other social services needs to band together in designing more holistic programs so that people that we care about serving are able to access these programs. One interesting proof point that the foundation is currently developing with the help of Magnet is called Early College, Early Career, which does take a very holistic approach to helping students, scholars from Cleveland Metropolitan School District, the Lorraine High School, as well as the Wycliffe High School, and getting them onto the manufacturing shop floor in manufacturing companies around the region for apprenticeships, for year-round employment, being paid $9 an hour, and apprenticing and getting the mentorship and getting the higher education at the community colleges so that they can start seeing a pathway for themselves in advanced manufacturing and build, get to family sustaining wages that starts to address these barriers.
Matt, and is this true for all levels of jobs, or it's a selected market of the lower wages jobs, higher wages jobs? Do you have a sense whether it's across the board in the workforce?
Well, I think that Shilpa touches on an important variable here, or group of variables in the labor market, which is sort of, if you think about it from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you have to have your basic needs met before you can move up sort of the higher level contribution ladder to society. And to the extent that society is not meeting the basic needs of laborers to enter and sustain employment, that's a problem. So I think on the solution side, there are a number of communities in Ohio that are trying to come up with sort of non-traditional solutions to some of these issues. And in economic development per se, there is, still a little bit of bifurcation between the economic development side and the community development side, but that line is blurring, as Jeff was pointing to. But there are some communities, for instance, that are developing sort of last mile transportation options for, particularly for the lower end of the labor spectrum, people who don't have the resources to buy their own vehicle, frankly. And so I think that's helping, and that's an important step. And sometimes we get criticism in economic development from the media that we're not attracting jobs that pay enough. But if you think about it, we are consciously trying to attract jobs at all levels of the spectrum. So people move up that ladder as they progress in their career, and those entry-level jobs are just as important as the high-skilled jobs, because people need a place to start, right? Or restart in many cases. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that we're conscious. The point is, I guess, we're conscious of this at all levels of economic development, about what some of the barriers to entry to the workforce are, and we're trying to solve some of those to the extent that we have the resources to do it.
Deb?
I'm just going to lend a slightly different angle to this conversation. Our foundation, because it's so laser focused on entrepreneurship, we do some workforce development through our work with the Fund for Economic Future, but we might look at this slightly differently. If I look at the programs that we're funding on college and university campuses, so we are applying metrics of, how many ventures they start, and do they create jobs, and are they producing revenue? So, and that's all good, and there are students who are starting businesses while they're, in their university careers. But we're really looking at those programs as a way to help students build that resiliency, the confidence, the entrepreneurial mindset that may eventually help them to create their own jobs, to sort of chart their own path forward, and see what they can do. I mean, we're looking at the world of work, in the decades to come in a different light. It's not going to look the way it does now, and people who are coming out of university now are going to have to reinvent themselves many times throughout their lives. And how are they going to do that? How are they going to draw upon, what they have learned and what they have built for themselves? And so I think we're seeing our entrepreneurship training programs in that light, helping them invent themselves and chart their path forward, maybe working for somebody else with an entrepreneurial mindset, or maybe creating a job for themselves. And we are seeing plenty of students who are doing that these days.
It's really that, because the jobs turnover is higher, and it's not because people are getting bored or not paid enough. It's just, I think, also increased curiosity and change of the product. It's something has to do with the business cycle, with the work environment, and people are moving across the jobs faster these days.
And with technology as well.
With technology as well, right. So I'm curious for Sasha to hear this, and we got the point on inefficiencies of government, and that's why we have more NGOs, because we do believe in not always the highest efficiency of government, but not having so thick nonprofit and philanthropic sector in Europe, and your universities being traditionally even like more focused on pure academic preparedness of the workforce. How do you deal with this issue?
Well, thank you for the question, because I just had a reflection. I completely agree with it, Deb. I think we should blame universities, and well, I can say that as from the position of university, because if I'm looking at especially European universities, but universities here as well, the incentive of universities is sometimes not to produce students which are ready for the market. The incentive is sometimes something completely different. I will not say no more, but I think this is the problem, because if you're looking at the successful companies and their founders, who are there? Sometimes they're leftovers from the university, that they never graduated and they're successful. Sometimes we have, for example, the most successful entrepreneur in Croatia is the guy his kind of sentence at when he was given the reward just yesterday was, despite of the government and despite of what I've learned at the university, I made it. So
we don't like to hear it here in the university walls, but yeah. It's a necessary discussion.
Actually, my conclusion is positive. And this is that we have to change. So the universities became, I would say, too hierarchical. And I believe that university has to be the the place where we have the most of the freedom. And in that sense, more and more involvement of the companies, of the kind of entrepreneurs in the programs would be favorable. In that sense, I would say that we do not produce, I'm saying this for Europe, I'm not sure about here, but we are not producing the students ready for market, and we are doing in our centers, which we set, our role model was this school. So we are trying to make kind of flexible programs which will enable kind of informal education of the workforce, graduate students and the practitioners with like kind of practical models, practical solutions, especially in the area of smart cities.
Shilpa.
So I'm going to pick up on the blaming universities. So I did get a chance to travel to the Netherlands in 2013, 2014, and there were two big takeaways. One was, A, the business is around the table and is really engaging with universities and is engaging with the K-12 system counterpart in Netherlands. And that is something that I think is really important. That's the role that economic development organizations play, because they are in touch with economic development organizations on an everyday basis. They understand the businesses, they understand the industries, they understand the trends. And therefore, as they start looking at equity issues and start looking at workforce issues, they have a significant role to play. This is not my story to tell, but the county executive has been convening workforce funders to look at a national best practice model around sector partnerships, and I think that that is very much in tune with and in alignment with everything that we see in Europe around engaging businesses. And then the last quick thing that I will say is that understanding what jobs are available, what industries are growing jobs is extremely important. It is shocking how little awareness there is in terms of the well-paying jobs in our community. We put out a report called, that was commissioned by the foundation and executed by FutureWorks, and now Team NEO has taken over the job of putting out data on a yearly basis. It's about to release its third iteration, and that, I think, is just very valuable information for the community, the educational institutions, four-year colleges, two-year colleges, and the K-12 system to be able to start preparing students that will truly meet the business need.
At this point, I would invite the questions from the audience if you want to ask. Tracy.
Well, since we're talking about universities and colleges, I'll just add on. Two things. The first is that I think tenure plays a role, because I think colleges and universities feel a need to put kids in seats for classes, even if we don't need 30 new sociologists or 30 new psychologists or 30 new logic, whatever the major is. So I find that there's a lot of kids who get an undergraduate degree they paid a lot of money for, and they're working at BW3 living in the basement because they find out it's not translatable without another degree. And I think tenure plays a role, and I think colleges and universities need to start talking about that and figuring out that the number of kids sitting in your class does not necessarily have to be the maximum per teacher, whatever. So that's a big thing. And the second thing is guidance counselors. I mean, that's like, there's one for every, 10,000 students in America now. And I know that when I was young, guidance counselors, you could go sit with them. They talk to you about all different careers. You could chat with them, ask them questions. It was a wonderful thing. You actually learned what things you might like instead of going to college without having a single clue of what you want to do. So if there's a way to help fund guidance counselors, even if they go from classroom to classroom to classroom across multiple schools, it would be really great to have a place where kids could go ask. We all know kids don't like to ask their parents, so if they have someone else they can ask, it might be helpful, and it might be something that we could really see some positive change, just funding a few guidance counselors.
Ellen.
I'd like to ask a question that has a little bit of an international perspective. Jeff particularly in your presentation, you pointed to globalization and the growth and where we can expect it. And maybe following up on talking about a moment ago the needs for the educational institutions to change, how would you look at your members and others in leadership roles in business and community and so forth, and how they're addressing right now the turmoil and changes in Washington, let's say particularly around tariffs, taxation, which affects manufacturing, jobs, inequality, and so forth. Is it a time for these leaders to step forward in their estimation, or do they see it as maybe a race to the bottom where, you know, the EU is not the place to go, but Vietnam and other low-wage countries are?
So I'm going to answer your question carefully. In terms of what, I'm going to answer this in two different ways. In terms of businesses, businesses have been voting with their dollars for a long time, and those dollars have voted in many ways, but I'm going to pick out three. One, when they saw a way to save money, improve stockholder value, and their own pay, CEOs, they took jobs offshore. If you looked at the industrial barons of Cleveland and Akron and Toledo in the mid-1900s, the early 1900s, they viewed themselves as having three investors: their shareholders, their communities, and their employees. And I think we've gotten to the point for many companies that the only investor that's important is the shareholders. So we are very quick to bring the cost down as quickly as possible, and so if it means going offshore, it has. Second, we may not like the tax bill exactly as it played out, but three things happened. The stock market boomed, and it continues to be bouncing around at all-time highs. Money did come back from overseas that there will be taxes on it. It will help pay down the debt in some small way, but there is nothing in that tax bill that enhances equity that I can tell, unless there's enough new jobs created at wages that improve the lot for many. I think that addresses many of your questions. The way I thought you were headed with that question, so I've answered from the business side. The economic development play, or for economic developers, I think they are ambivalent on the tax bill. I think they view these issues of keeping companies from offshoring or outsourcing fundamental. I mean, that's business retention 101. They are concerned about the equity issue, and they're trying to figure out what tools they have. And there's a new program, Tracy probably knows more about it than anybody in the room, called Opportunity Zones, that there may be some ability to capture enhanced investment in low-income areas. But then there's the giant in the room that none of us have talked about. This may not be the place today. Is things like Amazon HQ2, where these companies will dangle a bunch of jobs at a community, but what price do you have to pay for it in terms of large amount of incentives that we're having to buy a business in your community? So That doesn't answer your question perfectly, but that's about.
Could I follow up just quickly and say, I guess, the Henry Ford model of I pay high wages because that way my, my employees will buy my product. And looking at where we're going as a country, is this a time for rethinking? Because that seems to be what the panel is indicating. And is that heard, or is that part of the conversation at the top level?
I don't think it is the conversation being held at the top level. I don't think they teach that in business schools, and I think they teach them how do you, produce at the lowest cost, pay the as least as you can. But Blackstone is the big investment firm. The chairman of the board, or the CEO of Blackstone, sent out an interesting letter within the last 3 weeks, and he said, if you want our investment money, you are going to look at things beyond the bottom line. Now, is this a flash in the pan, or is this a trend that we may see? I don't know the answer to that.
We have one more question on that.
Good afternoon. Really enjoyed the comments thus far. But I would like to go back to one topic, and that would be, as one of the older demographic areas in the country with declining resources and taxes that are available, I'd like to hear about addressing the generation gap with regard to employment, especially with the displacement of a number of workers between 35 to 55 who are struggling to find their place in the new labor force. And also, Matt, if you could do me a favor and put a number on disposable income.
Sure. Well, I think that this is a really important question. And we've talked a lot about inputs to a strengthening economy today. But, let me also talk a little bit about outputs. So I guess you could see this as both. Ohio has attracted more millennial workers, which is the younger demographic, than our regional competitors over the last, say, 10 years. Now, we're not attracting younger workers at the rate that the coasts are, but we are attracting them faster here, and I think that's an indicator of job opportunities, that people see long-term job opportunities in Ohio and are flocking here, frankly, to take those opportunities. You hear a lot of talk about millennials wanting to go only to those cool places. Not to say that Ohio's not cool. I mean, we have the Cavs after all.
We're very cool. Come on.
But the most important thing is jobs, because everything else springs from that. And so we think, again, by providing job opportunities at every level of the income ladder, that is the right approach. And, we don't target individual demographic categories. It's just not the way that we focus on things. Maybe we should, but we don't target age cohorts. We target jobs at different levels of the socioeconomic ladder. And right or wrong, that's how economic development is done, not only here, but everywhere, frankly. But maybe you're saying that we should turn that model on its head. But the second part of your question is about disposable income. So let's talk a minute about that as well. It may be helpful to understand, what is that? What is disposable income exactly, mathematically? So disposable income is the money that workers have left over after taxes. And so Ohio, I'm looking at our economic overview section here, because the exact number here we go. So overall, income has grown in Ohio. The top line income, measured by average weekly earnings, since 2011 at a 21% rate versus the regional average of 16 or about 17%. And then we know that Ohio has lower taxes than the regional average as well. So, you know, disposable income has grown faster as a result here. So those are some of the metrics, but you know, you can find more on our website about that if you want to look at the actual details here.
Well, thank you, panel. And I do want to get to this sort of targeting piece and place making that I mentioned, that I heard you mention, Matt, but this, Jeff. This probably would be focused more to you, Jeff, and Shilpa. So I'm looking at in terms of, we have certainly communities within the city of Cleveland. And when we look at the metrics there, and some of them, in some cases, where the low-income individuals that are low income, let's say 70% and above, you have in some cases, and I've tracked it in terms of one community that I've worked in for many years, in terms of that leakage, in terms of people going out of the community to get the things that they need, so less supply than the demand, in some cases $50 million a year. And then you have these twice the national average in terms of unemployment in these areas. So when we look at economic development as a defined job creation, expansion, retention, it appears to me that in many cases we do have to do some targeting. Yes, so the question is how you do that, because these communities are really carrying the brunt of these negative indicators. And so I'm really looking for the strategies, both at the foundation level but at the state level, because again, we see jobs being created in other places you mentioned in terms of the challenges to get to those. But you have areas where jobs are not really being created. And so to some extent, what are the incentives that can be created so that, and I can go back in terms of things like the new markets tax credit has been put in place to try to create some things in these communities. But what else are we seeing? What else are we looking at? Because again, these areas in some cases are at the tipping point or beyond it. Can they recover? And we can also talk about the racial undertone in these areas.
So I'll jump in first, if you don't mind. You know, I had this conversation. I facilitated a community visioning process in Port Arthur, Texas, the end of January. And Port Arthur, Texas is a troubled community in some ways, and then it has huge amounts of capital investment because there are oil refineries all over the place. So they have both the best and the worst available to them. But so I was talking to the civic leadership. This is city council members, it's business leaders, and they are not at a tipping point. They're still in a decent place. But we talked about East St. Louis, Illinois. And East St. Louis, Illinois has typically been one of the 10 most distressed places in America. Camden, New Jersey, East St. Louis, East Chicago. I could probably name all 10 of them if I gave myself a couple of minutes to think about it. What is going on there? And what's going on there is two things. One, we've had a significant demographic change. If you look at East St. Louis, Illinois, 1960, it was 98% white middle-class blue-collar workers. The last time I was there was probably a decade ago. It was 40,000 largely African-American, low-income workers. Now, the state of Illinois came along and they said, we're going to give our low-income places a leg up. And by that, they said, you can have a gaming boat. For better or for worse, I don't pass moral judgments on these things, but the gaming boat was turning out I don't know, $2 million a month in net taxes for the city. So all of a sudden, the city's getting $24 million a year. They're now able to pay the police department. They're able to support their schools. They're able to do a bunch of things that they weren't able to do before the gaming boat showed up. Now, the gaming boat had a string attached to it. And the string was, their goal was to hire 70% local workers. They could never achieve that. Now, why was that? It was because the place was so bad, East St. Louis, that the minute people got the job, they moved out of town. And that becomes the conundrum that low-income communities have, and you have to tackle that issue in 2 or 3 ways simultaneously. You have to try to make them more competitive places so that you can bring jobs to them. And at the same time, you have to increase the quality of the place so that people actually see some enhancement and they feel like it's worth staying around. And so, and to a certain degree, it feels like a bottoming spiral. And when you talk about tipping point, those are terms that I tend to use too. How do you tip these things back up when it seems like that everything is going in the wrong direction? This opportunity zones may be a chance. We've tried enterprise zones. We've tried new markets tax credits. We've thrown lots of tools at these. You know, and I think you have to almost take it neighborhood at a time as you try to build these places back, as opposed to say, we're going to tackle an entire city at once.
So I'll pick up on the theme of neighborhoods and saying a lot of the foundation strategies, a lot of the foundation investments have been neighborhood by neighborhood, and it's it's awkward for me to be answering this question with Tracy Nichols in the room because she's primarily been the vision and the driver for some of this work that's already in play. The best example would be the health tech corridor between CSU and University Circle, and really being intentional about growing the area with both high-tech firms as well as the middle-skill job type of companies, and making sure that the CDCs serving these areas are also putting in a lot of effort in connecting the residents in these communities to the jobs that are being created in the communities. So that's an example of being more intentional about space. Also, all strategies that we are funding now are very explicit about being intentional about thinking of gender and thinking of race. That is extremely important in cities like Cleveland, which are a majority minority city. And so a lot of the programs in entrepreneurship that we have been jointly funding are designed in a way that they open up these innovation places and these innovation resources to entrepreneurs from the neighborhoods. So if you look at Jumpstart's Core City program, and I walk into that room, and it's a nice, fancy, modern-looking building, but it is predominantly brown and black when you walk into these events, and people are now feeling comfortable walking into these places and seeking the mentorship and the capital that they need to grow their businesses. So that's one point that I wanted to make. Well, a related point is, again, employee ownership, whether that is through companies like the Evergreen companies that are basically recruiting people from the neighborhoods, that are giving people a second chance where needed, and are building the wealth in the community so that it stays in the community. And then the other point I want to make is around connecting our next generation, the students that are in CMSD, and preparing them for these advanced manufacturing jobs, for the health IT jobs. And I feel very strongly about this because if we don't do intentional and a very strong job of that, and if we are not successful at that, we're going to leave a whole generation behind again, and Cleveland will be known for its biomedical strengths, but CMSD students would not be able to see a future for themselves in these industries. Health IT is one of the fastest growing subsectors in this area, and not being for a CMSD student not to see a career pathway for himself or herself and seeing, I can save somebody's life by working on this health IT machine, it would just be very, very sad. So it gets back to economic inclusion, it gets back to embedding wealth in the community and having a more neighborhood, gender, race-based approach.
And if,
We have one more. Oh,
can I just
please,
add to
Yes,
that,
absolutely.
just about CMSD students? A program that Morgan Foundation is funding through Western Reserve Historical Society is reaching down into the lower grades in CMSD around entrepreneurship and the entrepreneurial mindset, so starting in 4th grade. And then building, using the resources of the History Center and of Hale Farm, just teaching kids about the economy and that the role that they can play in the economy, looking at, healthcare jobs, manufacturing jobs. So it goes 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, and it's now reaching 5,000 students in CMSD every year now. So we're very happy about that.
Actually, on the level of the state, I've attended the state workforce summit organized by OMA. They are the manufacturers are funding now education for school counselors, and starting with the middle school on engaging those aboard. And they say 2 most important people in each school, they should buy first to education for manufacturing for prospective sectors that are principals and the people who guide the students.
And we've seen that too, just in terms of getting people engaged, that's the place to start.
We have one more, probably last question.
Thank you. So in keeping with the theme of education, Shilpa and Deborah, you've kind of touched on a few of these things here that may already kind of act as answers, but more specifically regarding curriculum and the idea of, a college degree as a sort of a necessity, but also sometimes as a barrier to entry. So the first part, curriculum, you talked about entrepreneurial programs going down into the grade schools. I'd be interested to hear other specific suggestions on what we can do from a younger age to sort of train our students for what comes the second part of that, graduate high school, graduate college if that's your choice, things like that. But regarding a college degree specifically, the past 15 years or so I've had 4 or 5 different jobs. Most of them have been general business oriented, ones that would very easily be defined as middle class. Every single one of them's required a college degree. I also spent a few years in law enforcement, which does not require a college degree, but that's probably the hardest job of all of them. So I'm wondering, in some of these professional careers that I've had, if you can have a conversation on telephone, if you can type an email, if you can interact with people, you can be very successful. But for folks who don't have the ability to pay their way through college, I'm wondering, is there anything else besides a college degree that we can use as sort of a requirement, so to speak, that would help maybe bridge that gap from, Matt, when you talked earlier about people getting into that lower income level, those entry-level jobs, a lot of people are finding themselves now, Jeff, you mentioned those middle-class jobs aren't coming back, they're stuck there. So what else can we do besides just an undergraduate degree to kind of bridge that gap?
So can I address your first question, which is about the younger kids and how we get entrepreneurial thinking into the curriculum? So that's really near and dear to our hearts, and so we are trying to provide more professional development for teachers in all, the K through 12 grades. Young Entrepreneur Institute is located here in Northeast Ohio. Greg Malkin is a great champion of youth entrepreneurship, reaching into schools across the region as a consultant to help them introduce programming that's appropriate for their students and their school culture. And then also with Morgan Foundation and other supporters across the region, putting together the Inspire Entrepreneurship Educator Conference every fall. Last fall, we hit 375 teachers attending that conference, and just giving them sort of the tools and just leads on different kinds of programs that they could introduce into their classrooms and into their curricula. So nothing that's like, okay, you have to do this A, B, C, and D, but just making sure that they know that there are lots of options out there from which to choose, and then helping them to pick the best ones. And then throughout the year, providing ongoing consultation to them and workshops so that they can continue to do that and solve problems as they go. Because this is a new field. It's not, there's nothing written in stone. The best practices are just emerging, so we all have to figure it out together. But I will say that Northeast Ohio, we've learned is really on the forefront of all of that in terms of having a network system as to how teachers and schools can introduce entrepreneurship.
So Jeff's over here elbowing me, saying, you should respond to this, you should respond to this. But no, he's right. I mean, we kind of looked at each other and said, said at the same time, certificates, it's really about portable skills, not necessarily degrees now. And it'd be really interesting. I totally agree with Deb that entrepreneurial thinking matters in every kind of skill or every kind of job. And it'd be interesting to know if there's some kind of certification in entrepreneurial thinking or, that kind of thing. But anyway, I think, unfortunately, the federal and state statistical agencies are behind on this a little bit in helping us to understand what those needs are and where we are with building out those skill sets. So, for instance, the Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks only job opportunities at the occupational level, not at the skill level. However, we have been engaged with the Governor's Office of Workforce Transformation in Ohio. What they did, and this was actually a couple of interns that did this because it's really labor intensive. But so, people doing it on the weekends and things, might not have worked out well. But and they've just sort of touched the tip of the iceberg. But these interns researched, they took the top 50 jobs in demand as identified by the Jobs and Family Services Agency, and they then crosswalked all the skills that are most in demand for each of those top 50 jobs. And what they found was, and you might imagine this, is that IT skills, rise to the top. Truck driver rises to the top. Microsoft Office products rises to the top. So there are certain themes that, if you take truck drivers out, there are certain themes that are consistent across those top 50 occupations. But I think what they did was they only looked at a single year of data because there's so much data. But this holds some real promise in looking at, and what they did actually was they looked at job postings for those top 50 jobs. And within those job postings, they actually looked at the keywords within each posting. So thousands and thousands of job postings they had to comb through to do this. But maybe with increased data analytics capabilities, the public sector could do a better job with this. I think that's where we need to go, is to understand at a more holistic level, what are those skills that are really in demand, not just those occupations that are in demand, and drive training, whether it's in academia, whether it's less formalized training, whether it's apprenticeships, drive all of that activity towards what that data is telling us about skills.
And I just want to add to the mix with information from the same Ohio Manufacturing Workforce Summit. I was at the table with representatives of two companies, Advanced Manufacturing and Biomed, and both companies said that they have career advancement where they would pay college education through. So it's kind of coming back with inshoring and kind of some barriers for offshoring now. Many companies are inshoring, and I think it's a similar process in how companies now relate back to their labor. They start to care more. They start to pay attention to medical benefits, and finally they start to pay more attention to education from within. Tracy, last comment. The answer is very simple. Combined statistical areas. Remember, they used to be combined CSAs, and then they said that's the wrong way to measure it. But we will help Team U to resurrect it. So at this point, I want to really thank all our panelists and the Jeff who beat the blizzard and came here. And most of all, I want to thank you, the audience, who stayed with us in this very interesting discussion. Please stay tuned. We will have more discussions on these topics. Thank you very much.